Is my dog telepathic? I tested Sheldrake's theory. Look, I need to start this video with a confession that will sound completely crazy, but I swear, I truly swear, that what I've experienced in the last few weeks has completely changed my perception of reality. You know that feeling when you think you know the world, that you understand how things work, and suddenly something happens that turns everything upside down? That's exactly what happened to me. And it all started with my dog, Theo. Yes, the Theo you've seen in a few videos here, that clumsy golden retriever who's always stealing socks from the laundry basket. But before you think this is just another cute video of a dog doing funny things, I need to tell you that the problem goes much deeper indeed. Because what I discovered about Theo, about dogs in general, and about the connection between humans and animals will challenge everything you learned in school about science, biology, and how the brain works. And the most impressive thing is that this isn't just my hunch. It's not just some doting dog owner spouting nonsense. There's a scientist, a British biologist named Rupert Sheldrake, who has dedicated decades of his life to studying exactly this: the possibility that our dogs are telepathic. I know you're probably thinking, wow, here she goes with those crazy internet theories. And I completely understand, because I used to think so myself. Until 3 weeks ago, if someone told me that dogs could read minds, I would laugh and change the subject. But then things started happening that I simply couldn't ignore anymore. And the more I researched, the more I came across this name, Rupert Sheldrake. This guy isn't some internet nutcase. He's a Cambridge-educated biologist who worked at Harvard, has a PhD in biochemistry, and has published over 100 scientific papers in respected journals. And this man has spent years, literally years, conducting rigorous experiments to test whether dogs really know when their owners are coming home, even when there's no logical explanation for it. The results? Well, the results are chilling. But before I tell you all about his experiments and the tests I've done here at home, let me tell you how it all began. It was a normal Thursday. I was at work, having left home around 7 a.m. As usual, and Theo had fallen asleep in his bed in the living room. My mom was at home working from her home office, so she could observe his behavior throughout the day. And look, Theo is a dog of routine. Every day he wakes up, has breakfast, plays a little, sleeps until about 10 a.m., then wakes up again, keeps asking for food even though he's already eaten, sleeps a little more, and around 5 p.m., he starts getting anxious because he knows it's almost time for me to get home. That's normal, right? Dogs have biological clocks. They learn schedules, nothing special. But on this particular day, something different happened. I was in the middle of a boring work meeting, the kind that never ends. And suddenly I felt incredibly homesick for Theo. It was inexplicable. I started thinking about him, imagining him lying in the living room, thinking how much I wanted to get home soon so I could pet him. That was exactly 2:30 in the afternoon. I remember the time because I looked at my watch at that moment thinking, wow, I still have so many hours until I get out of here. And I spent about 5-10 minutes just thinking about Theo, looking at his picture on my phone hidden under the meeting table, you know? That moment of a truly doting dog owner, When I got home that night, my mother told me something that sent butterflies down my spine. She said that at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, Theo had suddenly woken from his deep sleep, gone straight to the living room window overlooking the gate, and stood there staring at the street, waiting. She thought it was strange because it wasn't even close to my usual time of arrival, and he'd stayed there, standing at the window for about 15 minutes. Then he came back, lay down, and slept again normally. When my mother told me this, I felt a chill. Because it made no sense at all. There were no familiar car sounds, it wasn't my time. There was no external trigger that could explain why Theo had done that precisely when I was thinking about him so intensely. I could have ignored it. I could have thought, what a funny coincidence, and moved on with my life. But I couldn't, because in the following days I started paying attention, and I realized this was happening with disturbing frequency. Every time I thought intensely about Theo during the day, when I was away, my mother would report strange behaviors from him at that very moment. And look, my mother didn't know I was doing this mental test. I didn't tell her anything. I just wrote down the times I focused my thoughts on Theo and then compared them with what she told me about his behavior throughout the day, and the correspondence was frightening, really frightening. That's when I started researching this online. I typed things like, dog knows when owner is thinking about him, telepathic dog, dog mental connection with owner. And that's how I came across Rupert Sheldrake's work. And when I started reading about this man's research, I was absolutely fascinated and at the same time disturbed, because he wasn't talking about guesswork. He wasn't talking about New Age spirituality or anything like that. He was presenting data, controlled experiments, statistics that showed something that traditional science simply won't accept. There is indeed a form of communication between humans and dogs that goes beyond the 5 known senses. Sheldrake has a book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, which is essentially a compilation of years and years of research into this phenomenon. He began by collecting stories from thousands of dog owners around the world who reported the same thing. Their dogs knew when they were coming home, even in situations where there was no physical clue. We're talking about situations where the person returns at completely random times, using different cars, taking different routes, and yet the dog goes to the door or window exactly when the owner decides to return home. Not when they get close to home, but when they decide, when they think, now I'm going back. And Sheldrake wasn't content with just anecdotal stories. He went further. He created rigorous experiments, with cameras filming the dogs continuously, with owners leaving at random times determined by others, controlling every possible variable. One of his most famous experiments was with a dog named JT, a terrier who belonged to a woman named Pam Smart. The experiment worked like this. Pam left the house at completely random times, went to different places, sometimes staying away for hours, sometimes for minutes. A camera filmed JT the entire time. And the results were impressive. In over 100 different tests, JT went to the window or door an average of 18 minutes before Pam began her return trip. Not when Pam was getting close, but when she decided to return, when she thought, okay, now I'm going home. Skeptics, of course, attacked this research. They said the dog was responding to subtle cues, to sounds humans can't hear, to unconscious behavior patterns. So Sheldrake made the tests even more rigorous. Pam began returning using different cars, taking different routes, being driven by other people who randomly decided when to return. And JT kept getting it right. Not always, of course. We're not talking 100% accuracy, but the accuracy rate was too statistically significant to be explained by coincidence or any known physical clue. We're talking about somewhere around 45% to 55% accuracy, depending on the experiment, whereas the expected accuracy by chance would be somewhere around 5% to 10%. When I read about this, my mind exploded. Because if this is real, if this connection really exists, it changes everything. It completely changes our understanding of consciousness, of communication, of the limits of the mind. And I needed to test this with Theo. I needed to know if what I was experiencing was real, or if it was just confirmation bias, if it was just me wanting to see patterns where none existed. So I decided to create my own home experiment, inspired by Sheldrake's work, but adapted to my reality. And look, what I discovered in the following 2 weeks was so intense, so inexplicable, that I'm still processing it all. Before I tell you about my experiment and the results, I need to talk a little more about the theory behind it all. Because Sheldrake isn't just saying dogs are telepathic, and that's it. He has a larger theory, a controversial one he calls morphic resonance. Basically, the idea is that there's a kind of collective memory field that connects organisms non-locally. It's not electromagnetic energy, it's nothing that can be detected by current scientific instruments. It's something that transcends space and time as we know it. And according to Sheldrake, this field is especially strong between individuals who have intense emotional bonds. That's why the connection works so well between humans and their pets, especially dogs, because we have thousands of years of co-evolution with them, thousands of years building this bond. Now, I know many mainstream scientists hate Sheldrake. They really do. He's been called a pseudoscientist, he's been ridiculed, he's had his career destroyed. But here's the interesting thing. No one has actually been able to convincingly refute his experiments. The criticisms are usually along the lines of, this can't be real because it contradicts everything we know about physics and biology. But they're not sound methodological criticisms. It's more a rejection based on the current scientific paradigm than based on concrete evidence that the experiments are wrong. And this got me thinking. How many times in the history of science has the established paradigm rejected ideas that later proved true? Heliocentrism, germ theory, quantum mechanics. All of these things were initially ridiculed because they challenged the consensus of the time. I'm not saying Sheldrake is definitely right. I'm not a scientist. I don't have the tools to rigorously validate all of this. But what I can say is this. The experiments I performed here at home, with every possible care to eliminate variables, produced results that I simply can't explain in any way other than through this idea of a telepathic or extrasensory connection. And I'll tell you exactly what I did, how I did it, and what happened, so you can draw your own conclusions. First, I installed a camera in the living room that would film Theo the entire time I was away from home. It was one of those simple home security cameras, but it records continuously and has precise timekeeping. Second, I asked a friend to create a spreadsheet with completely random times during my workday. She used a random number generator to set 10 different times over the course of 2 weeks, and I didn't have access to these times beforehand. She would send me a silent text message on my phone saying simply, "Now." And when I received this message, I would stop what I was doing and spend exactly 5 minutes intensely focusing my thoughts on Theo. It wasn't just passively thinking about him. It was visualizing him, imagining I was arriving home, feeling the excitement of wanting to be with him. It was a very focused and directed mental intention. Third important point, my mother knew nothing about this. She remained at home, carrying out her normal routine, unaware that I was conducting any kind of experiment. This was crucial to eliminate any possibility that she, consciously or unconsciously, was influencing Theo's behavior or selectively recording moments when he did something interesting. Fourth, after each day of testing, I reviewed the camera recordings, marking all the moments when Theo displayed specific behaviors, such as going to the window, going to the door, becoming agitated, vocalizing more than usual, or any significant change in behavior. I did this before checking the times I had performed the mental transmission to avoid bias. The results? Well, for the first few days, I was disappointed. It didn't seem to be working. Of the first 10 tests, in only 2 of them did Theo show different behavior at the right time, and I thought, okay, it must just be coincidence, confirmation bias, me trying to see something that isn't there. But then I noticed something interesting. I started reviewing the recordings more carefully, and noticed that even when Theo didn't physically go to the window or door at the exact moment of the transmission, he often showed subtle signs of state change. For example, he would be sound asleep and suddenly lift his head, stare into space for a few seconds, then go back to sleep. Or he would be lying peacefully and start moving his ears, as if listening to something, but there was no audible sound in the recording. When I started counting these subtle behaviors as well, the match rate rose to around 60%. But it was in test number 17 that something happened that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It was a Tuesday. I was in an important presentation at work, focused, concentrating. Then my phone vibrated with a message from my friend. I quickly glanced and saw now. But I was literally about to start my presentation, with about 30 people waiting, including important bosses. I thought to myself, wow, what terrible timing. But I had committed to the experiment, so I quickly went to the bathroom, locked the door, set the timer for 5 minutes, and closed my eyes. And this time it was different. This time I felt something. I can't quite explain it, but it was as if during those 5 minutes I was actually connecting with Theo somehow. It wasn't passive imagination. It was as if I were sending him a direct message, as if there were an invisible thread connecting us, and I could feel the message being received on the other end. I know this sounds crazy, but that's exactly how I felt. When I got home that night and went to review the recording, I nearly fell over. The exact minute I started the mental transmission, Theo, who was fast asleep on the couch, jumped up, went straight to the front door, started moaning and scratching at the door, stayed there for almost 3 minutes, then went to the window and stared at the street for another 2 minutes. The temporal correspondence was perfect, precise. It couldn't be a coincidence. And look, throughout the entire recording that day, this was the only moment he displayed such intense behavior outside of normal hours. When I saw that, I started crying. I can't explain why, but it was as if everything suddenly made sense, as if I had just discovered something fundamental about reality, about connection, about love. I continued testing over the next few weeks, and the more I practiced this focused mental transmission, the stronger the connection seemed to become. It was like a muscle you develop with practice. The last 10 tests I ran had a match rate of over 70%, and I'm talking about clear, unambiguous matches, not subtle signals that can be interpreted in various ways. Theo was responding to my thoughts even though he was miles away with no physical clues. And I began to realize it wasn't just during the experiments. In my normal day-to-day life, I began to notice a greater connection between us. When I got home, he'd be waiting for me at the door before I'd even parked the car. When I was sad at work, even without talking to anyone at home, I'd arrive and he'd come straight to comfort me, in a way that was different from usual, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling. But the most intense experience of all happened on a Friday. I had just received bad news at work, having been passed over for a promotion I'd been waiting for months, and I was devastated. I sat at my desk, staring blankly at my computer, feeling that mixture of anger, sadness, and frustration. And without realizing it, I started crying right there in the office. I had to go to the bathroom to compose myself, and in that moment, alone in the bathroom, I thought of Theo. I thought of how he always made me feel better, how unconditional his love was, how I so desperately wanted to be home right now, to feel his fur, hear him breathe, have his comforting presence. And I consciously sent him a mental message. It wasn't part of the experiment, nothing planned. It was just a desperate impulse to seek comfort. I mentally told him, "Theo, I need you now." When I got home a few hours later, my mom told me something that made me burst into tears again. She said that afternoon, about 3 hours before I arrived, Theo had suddenly become very agitated. He kept pacing back and forth between the door and the window, crying softly, restlessly. She thought it was so strange that she even thought he was sick. She tried to calm him down, giving him water, giving him treats, but he remained agitated. And when I finally got home and opened the door, he came running with an intensity I'd never seen before. It wasn't the normal joy of seeing me arrive. It was something more. It was as if he'd sensed my pain, my need for him, and had become desperate to reach me. He stayed close to me all night, didn't even leave my side to eat, just stared at me with those eyes full of love and concern. It was at that moment that I became absolutely certain that there is indeed something beyond what traditional science recognizes. You can call it telepathy. You can call it morphic resonance like Sheldrake. You can call it a quantum connection. You can call it whatever you want. But there is a form of non-local communication between beings who deeply love each other. And it's not just with dogs. Sheldrake has also studied this with other animals, with pigeons, parrots, even humans. There are thousands of reports of mothers who wake up suddenly in the middle of the night feeling something is wrong with their child on the other side of the world, only to discover that at that very moment their child was in danger. Twins who feel each other's physical pain, even when separated. People who think of someone they haven't seen in years, and seconds later that person calls. Traditional science calls all this coincidence, confirmation bias, selective memory. And yes, much of it can be explained that way, but not all of it. Not when you control the variables, when you conduct rigorous experiments, when you really pay attention. The problem is that the current scientific paradigm is so committed to materialism, to the idea that everything can be reduced to particles and physical forces, that anything that suggests phenomena beyond that exist is automatically rejected without proper investigation. And this is bad for science because science should be about being open to discovering the truth, not about defending dogma. Sheldrake himself talks about this a lot. He gave a controversial TED Talk where he discusses the 10 dogmas of modern science that limit scientific inquiry. One of these dogmas is the idea that consciousness is merely a product of the brain, that nothing exists beyond physical matter. And he asks, how can we be so sure of this? All human experience suggests there's something more. The experience of love, connection, intuition, premonition, creativity. All of these point to something that doesn't fit neatly into the materialist model. But instead of investigating this with an open mind, the mainstream scientific community prefers to ignore or ridicule it. And in the process, we miss incredible opportunities to better understand the nature of reality. Look, I'm not saying everyone should go around believing anything without evidence. Skepticism is important. Scientific rigor is important, but there's a difference between healthy skepticism and dogmatic skepticism. Healthy skepticism says, "This seems unlikely, so I'll demand strong evidence before accepting it." Dogmatic skepticism says, "This contradicts my fundamental beliefs, so I'll automatically reject it, no matter how much evidence is presented." And unfortunately, much of the skepticism surrounding Sheldrake's work seems to be of the latter type. After doing these experiments with Theo, I started talking to other people about their experiences with pets. And boy, the stories I heard were incredible. A friend of mine told me that her cat always knows when she's coming back from a trip, even when she returns on completely unexpected days and times. The cat goes to the window and waits, always a few minutes before she arrives. Another friend told me that his dog started howling desperately in the middle of the night. And at that exact moment, his grandmother, who lived in another city, was having a fatal heart attack. He only found out the next morning when he got the call from his family, but when he checked the time, it was exactly right. And you know what's most impressive? When you start paying attention to this, when you open your mind to the possibility that these connections are real, they start happening more frequently. It's as if the very awareness of being aware of these phenomena somehow amplifies them. Sheldrake talks about this too. He calls it positive expectancy. It's not magical thinking like you create your own reality. It's more subtle than that. It's as if when you recognize and value these connections, you naturally strengthen them. In the same way that a human relationship grows stronger when you pay attention to it and nurture it. Since I started doing these experiments, my relationship with Theo has changed profoundly. Not that it wasn't good before, but now there's an extra layer of awareness, presence, even reverence. I look at him and think, "You're not just a cute animal that I feed and care for. You're a conscious being with whom I share a deep connection that transcends physical space. You feel what I feel. You know when I need you. We're connected in a way I don't fully understand, but I know is real. And that changes everything. It changes how I interact with him. It changes the level of respect and gratitude I feel. It even changes how I think about consciousness and my place in the universe." And look, I know there are a lot of people who will watch this video and think I'm delusional, that I've been co-opted by pseudoscience, that I need a reality check, and that's okay. I completely understand. If someone had shown me this video 3 months ago, I would probably have had the same reaction. but I challenge you to do this. If you have a dog or any pet with whom you have a strong bond, try your own experiment. Set up a camera, get a friend to text you at random times, and in those moments, stop and intensely focus your thoughts on your animal. Visualize it, feel love for it, send a clear mental message. Do this 10, 15 times over the course of a few weeks. Then review the recordings honestly, without cherry-picking, without selecting only the moments that confirm what you want to see. Look at all the data, and then draw your own conclusions. The beauty of science, real science, is that it's based on empirical evidence. You don't have to believe what I'm saying. You can test it yourself. And if you really test it, with an open mind but also with rigor, I'm very curious to see what you discover, because I suspect many of you will have experiences similar to mine. And if that happens to enough people, if enough people start recognizing and talking about these experiences, maybe, just maybe, mainstream science will start taking this seriously and investigating it properly. What gives me hope is that there are already some signs of change. Quantum mechanics, for example, has already shown that the universe is much stranger and more interconnected than we imagined. Concepts like quantum entanglement, where two particles can be connected instantaneously regardless of the distance between them, are already accepted and proven. So we already know that at least one type of non-local connection exists in nature. Why would it be so absurd to think that there are other types of non-local connection that we don't yet fully understand? Why would it be so absurd to think that consciousnesses can be entangled in the same way as quantum particles? There are some cutting-edge physicists and neuroscientists who are beginning to explore these ideas. People like Dean Radin, who conducts experiments on PSI phenomena in rigorous laboratories. People like Deepak Chopra, who, while controversial, raises interesting questions about consciousness and reality. The Institute of Noetic Sciences itself, founded by astronaut Edgar Mitchell, is dedicated to scientifically studying consciousness-related phenomena that traditional science ignores. So there are serious people with impeccable credentials who are willing to investigate these frontiers. But back to Theo and my personal experience. One of the most interesting things I noticed during these experiments is that the quality of my intentions seemed to matter. When I just vaguely thought about Theo, like, "Oh, I miss Theo so much," the response rate was low. But when I really focused, when I put intense emotion into it, when I vividly visualized and felt deeply, the response rate was much higher. This suggests that it's not just about thinking about someone. It's about the quality, the intensity, the clarity of the mental transmission. It's almost as if there's a technique, a skill that can be developed and refined. And this makes perfect sense when you consider Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance. If there truly is a field that connects consciousnesses, then it would make sense that the more you learn to tune into that field, the more effective the communication would be. It's like learning to play an instrument or a language. At first, you're clumsy and imprecise, but with practice, you become more skilled. And perhaps this is exactly what shamans, mystics, and spiritual practitioners of various traditions have been doing for thousands of years. Perhaps they developed techniques to tune into these connecting fields, and we in modern Western culture, with our excessive focus on materialism and rationalism, have lost these skills, atrophied these muscles of consciousness that should come naturally to us. This made me think a lot about how we educate children today. We teach math, Portuguese, science, history. All of these are important, of course, but we teach nothing about awareness, about intuition, about how to develop and trust these subtle perceptions we all have. On the contrary, we actively discourage them. When a child says, "I felt Grandma was sad even though she was far away," we say, "Don't be silly, you're imagining things." When a child insists that the dog understands everything they think, we laugh and say they're anthropomorphizing. And little by little, we shut down these natural abilities, we close these doors of perception, until by the time we're adults, most of us don't even remember they exist anymore. But you know what's fascinating? Young children seem to have these abilities much more strongly. Sheldrake documented several cases of children who had clear telepathic connections with their pets, and these connections often diminished as the children grew older and were socialized into the materialistic paradigm. It's not that the children lost the ability, it's that they learned to ignore it, to distrust it, to treat it as imagination rather than real perception. And that's a huge loss. It's as if we have a sixth sense, but society teaches us from an early age to pretend it doesn't exist. There's a story Sheldrake tells in his book that really resonated with me. It's about an autistic boy who had an incredibly strong connection with the family dog. The boy had severe verbal difficulties, barely able to speak, but he communicated perfectly with the dog. And it wasn't just that the dog responded to commands or behavioral cues. It was something much deeper. The boy's parents began to notice that the dog knew exactly when the boy was about to have an anxiety episode or a sensory meltdown, sometimes 15 or 20 minutes in advance. The dog would go to the boy and stay with him, calming him, and often managed to prevent the episode altogether. How? How did the dog know? There were no obvious physical clues. The parents began to believe there was a direct communication between the boy and the dog that occurred on a level that transcended the physical. Most strikingly, when the researchers tested this in a controlled manner, placing the boy and the dog in separate rooms and monitoring both, They found that the dog showed signs of agitation precisely at the moments when the boy was beginning to become anxious, even without any visual or auditory contact between them. The correlation was too statistically significant to be explained by chance. And this wasn't an isolated case. Sheldrake has documented dozens of similar cases with autistic children and their therapy animals. It seems that autistic people, perhaps precisely because they process sensory information differently, sometimes retain greater access to these unconventional forms of communication that the rest of us learn to suppress. This also made me think about cases of animals who saved their owners in inexplicable ways. You've probably heard stories like these. Kittens who wake the family in the middle of the night because there's a gas leak no human had detected yet. Cats who refuse to let their owners leave the house, only to discover that a terrible accident would have happened if the owner had left. Birds who become agitated hours before an earthquake. Traditional science explains some of these cases by saying that animals have heightened senses, that they can detect subtle changes in atmospheric pressure, smells that humans can't perceive, sounds at frequencies we can't hear. And yes, this certainly explains a lot. But does it explain everything? There's one particular story I read during my research that gave me chills. It's about a woman in California who had a Labrador. She was planning to take a specific flight to visit family in another state. The flight was on a Tuesday morning, but the Sunday before the trip, the dog started acting extremely strange. He literally put himself between her and the door whenever she tried to leave the house. He started crying and howling every time she picked up her suitcase. She had never seen the dog act like that. She almost canceled the trip because of his behavior, but ended up deciding to go anyway because it was important. The dog was absolutely frantic when she left to catch a taxi to the airport. She told me later that she almost went back, almost canceled the whole thing, because the dog's distress was so intense that it broke her heart. But she continued on to the airport, and when she got there, she discovered that the flight had been canceled due to technical problems with the aircraft. She caught another flight a few hours later and arrived safely. But a few days later, she learned through the news that the specific aircraft that was supposed to be her flight, after undergoing rapid repairs, suffered a catastrophic failure during a subsequent flight. There were no fatalities because the pilots managed to make an emergency landing, but it was a close call. If she had taken that original flight, she would have been on that plane during the failure. Did the dog know? How could he know? There was no physical information available to him that could have indicated that that particular flight was in trouble, and yet, he desperately tried to prevent her from traveling. Now, a skeptic might say, "That's just a story, there's no way to verify it. The woman is probably exaggerating or distorting her memory, and even if it's true, it's just coincidence." There are millions of pets in the world, some of which will behave strangely before something happens, just by chance, and those are the cases that go viral, while the millions of cases where nothing happens are ignored. And look, that's a valid criticism. Anecdotal stories, no matter how impressive, aren't scientific proof. But here's the thing. When you have thousands of similar stories, from different cultures, different historical periods, from people who have no connection to each other and no reason to lie, at some point you have to ask, are all these people mistaken? Is it all just coincidence and confirmation bias, or is there a real pattern here that deserves serious investigation? Sheldrake argues that modern science has a fundamental methodological problem when it comes to these types of phenomena. These phenomena are spontaneous, not easily reproducible in a laboratory on demand. You can't just put a dog in a room and expect it to have a premonition. It doesn't work that way. It's like trying to study love or creativity. These are real phenomena, but they don't fit neatly into the traditional scientific method, which demands perfect reproducibility under controlled conditions. And yet no one doubts that love and creativity exist, even if they are difficult to quantify in the laboratory. So what Sheldrake proposes is an expansion of the scientific method, maintaining rigor, maintaining a healthy skepticism, maintaining the demand for evidence, but also being open to methods of inquiry that are appropriate for phenomena that are by nature spontaneous and dependent on emotional context. This means collecting large amounts of careful observational data, looking for statistical patterns, conducting field experiments in natural settings rather than just in sterile laboratories. And that's exactly what he's been doing for decades, with results that I think any open-minded person should at least seriously consider. But there's another aspect to this whole story that I think is important to mention. It has to do with what happens when you start recognizing and honoring these connections. After I did these experiments with Theo and began to truly believe that our mental connection was real, something changed in our dynamic. I started communicating with him differently. It wasn't just verbal commands or physical gestures. I started consciously sending him thoughts throughout the day. When I was at work and wanted him to know I was thinking of him, I would stop for a moment and mentally send love his way. When I was heading home, I would mentally warn him a few minutes in advance, and I began to notice that he responded. He was always waiting for me at the door when I arrived, even when I returned at completely different times than usual. And here's something I didn't expect. The connection started working both ways. I started to sense when Theo needed me. Sometimes I'd be at work, and suddenly I'd get an urgent feeling that I needed to call home and check on Theo. And when I did, my mom would say things like, "How strange you're calling now. Theo was crying a few minutes ago." Or, "He just threw up. I was going to text you." It happened so often, it couldn't be a coincidence. It was as if the line of communication I'd consciously opened from myself to him had also opened from him to me. We'd established a two-way connection, and this got me thinking about human relationships too. How often do you think of someone out of the blue, and seconds later they text you? How many times do you sense something's wrong with someone you love, even though you're far away, only to later discover that it really is? How often do you and a close friend say the same thing at the same time or have the same idea simultaneously? We treat all this as a funny coincidence, but is it really? Could it be that between people who have strong emotional bonds, this non-local communication I was experiencing with Theo also exists? And if we started paying attention to this, cultivating it consciously, how would our relationships change? How would our understanding of intimacy and connection change? I started doing informal experiments with people close to me as well. For example, sometimes when I was thinking a lot about a particular friend, I wouldn't text her right away. I'd first focus my thoughts on her for a few minutes, mentally trying to convey, "Hi, I'm thinking about you," and then I'd wait to see if she'd contact me, and it worked surprisingly often. Not always, of course, but much more often than would be expected by chance. And when I told my friend about these experiments, she said she'd also noticed that she often thought of me just before I texted or called. We'd never paid attention to it before, but once we started, the pattern was clearly there. There's a famous experiment by Sheldrake and other researchers called sensing the gaze. Basically, you have a person sitting with their back to the other person, and another person, at random times, either stares at the back of the first person's head or looks away. The seated person has to press a button when they sense they're being watched, and the results of thousands of these tests show that people get it right significantly above what would be expected by chance. It's not 100%, it's not even 80%, but it's consistently around 55 to 60%, which is statistically very significant when you do thousands of trials. People really do seem to be able to sense when they're being watched, even without any visual or auditory cues. This is fascinating because we already know this intuitively, right? How many times have you been in a public place and suddenly felt someone staring, turned around, and it really was someone looking at you? It happens all the time. We just ignore it, treating it as something trivial, unimportant. But if you stop and think about it, it's extremely strange from the perspective of classical physics. How can light reflected from another person's eyes reaching you make you feel something before you even consciously see that person? It shouldn't work that way, and yet it does. Sheldrake argues that this is further evidence that there is a connection between consciousnesses that transcends known physical mechanisms. Now, I know there are many people who will hear all this and still say, but where's the explanation? How does this work? What's the mechanism? And that's a fair question. The problem is that we still don't have a complete explanation in terms of current scientific paradigms. Sheldrake's morphic resonance theory is an attempt at an explanation, but it's itself speculative and not fully developed mathematically and experimentally. But here's the thing. A lack of a complete explanation isn't the same as evidence that something doesn't exist. There was a time when we clearly observed objects falling toward the ground, but there was no explanation for why. Gravity was an observable phenomenon long before Newton created a mathematical theory for it. And even Newton's theory doesn't really explain what gravity fundamentally is. It just describes how it behaves. Einstein came closer with general relativity. But even today, there are aspects of gravity that we don't fully understand. So just because we don't have a complete explanation for animal telepathy or non-local connection between consciousnesses doesn't mean we should reject the empirical evidence that something is happening. It means we need more research, more theorizing, more openness to exploring ideas that may seem strange or impossible at first glance. And unfortunately, the current scientific climate is very hostile to this kind of exploration. Scientists who venture into these fields risk their careers, their reputations, and have difficulty securing research funding. And this means these phenomena remain underexplored. Not because they aren't real, but because the scientific establishment has decided they don't deserve serious investigation. This makes me sad and frustrated because science should be about curiosity, about exploration, about following the evidence wherever it leads. But instead, modern science has often become dogmatic, more about protecting established paradigms than about discovering new truths. And I understand where this comes from. There are so many charlatans out there, so many people making wild claims with no evidence whatsoever, that serious scientists have become hyper-cautious, hyper-skeptical of anything that smacks of pseudoscience. And this caution is understandable and even necessary to a point. But when it goes too far, when it becomes an automatic refusal to investigate anything that challenges the established paradigm, it ceases to be science and becomes dogma. What gives me hope is that more and more ordinary people are having experiences like mine and are beginning to question and investigate for themselves. The internet has democratized information in an unprecedented way. Now anyone can read Sheldrake's original papers, can learn about his experiments in detail, can decide for themselves whether the evidence is convincing. Anyone can conduct their own home experiments and share the results. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people start doing this, if a critical mass of anecdotal evidence emerges that cannot be ignored, mainstream science will have to pay attention. I also discovered during my research that there are serious organizations and researchers working in these areas despite the mainstream's hostility. The Rhine Research Center in North Carolina has been studying parapsychological phenomena for decades with rigorous methodology. The Institute of Noetic Sciences funds research on consciousness and anomalous phenomena. There are departments at some respected universities that study these things quietly, without much fanfare, because they know they will be ridiculed if they speak too openly about it. So the work is happening. Slowly, quietly, but it is happening. And over time, with enough evidence accumulated from multiple independent sources, perhaps the paradigm will begin to shift. One thing that particularly fascinated me in my reading of Sheldrake's work was the evolutionary question. If this capacity for non-local communication between animals and their humans truly exists, how did it evolve? Sheldrake argues that it makes perfect evolutionary sense. Dogs were domesticated at least 15,000 years ago, possibly much longer. During this entire time, there was tremendous selective pressure for dogs that could understand and anticipate their humans' needs and intentions. Dogs that were better at this received more care, more food, more protection, and therefore had greater reproductive success. And humans also benefited from having dogs that were highly attuned to them. So there was coevolution, a mutual selection, that over thousands of generations could very well have developed or amplified non-local communication capabilities. And it's not just dogs. Horses also show remarkable sensitivity to their riders' emotional states and intentions. Cats, though more independent than dogs, also display these connections with their favorite humans. Even domesticated birds like parrots display surprising abilities to attune themselves to humans. Sheldrake documented the case of an African gray parrot named Nkisi, who appeared to be able to read his owner's thoughts with statistically significant accuracy in controlled tests. So this appears to be a general phenomenon that emerges in species that have developed close, long-term relationships with humans. But here's something even more interesting. This apparently isn't limited to domesticated animals. There are documented accounts of wild animals developing relationships with specific humans and seeming to display these same capabilities. Sheldrake mentions the case of a researcher who studied wolves in the wild and over the years developed a trusting relationship with a specific pack. He reported that the wolves often seemed to know when he was approaching the research area, even when he came from different directions and at different times than usual. They were waiting for him. How did they know? He had no way of communicating in advance when he would arrive. There are also fascinating cases of dolphins and whales that appear to have telepathic connections with specific humans. Researchers who have worked with cetaceans for years often report experiences of communication that go far beyond visual or auditory signals. They describe moments of profound connection where they seem to be able to intuit what the animal is feeling or wanting, and the animal seems to respond to thoughts not expressed verbally. The mainstream scientific community dismisses this as anthropomorphization or an exaggerated interpretation of normal behaviors. But people who actually work closely with these animals for long periods are almost unanimous in saying that there is something more going on. And that brings me back to Theo and what I learned from this whole experience. What impacted me most wasn't just the confirmation that this telepathic connection exists, although that's fascinating in itself. What impacted me most was how recognizing and honoring this connection transformed my relationship with him, and by extension, transformed my relationship with the world around me. Because once you accept that this kind of deep, non-physical connection between consciousnesses exists, you can no longer see the world the same way. You begin to realize that everything is connected in ways that go far beyond obvious physical interactions. I've started paying more attention to nature in general. When I see birds in the garden, I no longer see just biological machines operating on instinct. I see consciousnesses, small ones, different from my own, but consciousnesses nonetheless. When I see a tree, I wonder, do plants also have some kind of perception, some kind of consciousness so different from ours that we don't even recognize it as consciousness? There's research showing that plants respond to threats even before they're touched, that they seem capable of communicating danger to neighboring plants through chemical signals and possibly other means we don't understand. Could there be a field of consciousness that permeates all life, connecting all organisms in subtle ways we're only just beginning to glimpse? This may sound very mystical, very woo-woo to some of you, and I understand. A year ago, I would have thought the same thing, but direct experience changes you. When you live something, when you test something for yourself and see it work over and over again, you can no longer deny it just because it doesn't fit perfectly with what you were taught in school. And look, I'm not saying I believe in anything now. I haven't become a person who blindly believes every mystical or spiritual claim that comes along. I remain skeptical about many things. I still value evidence and rigor. But now my skepticism is directed. It's not an automatic slam dunk to anything that challenges the materialist paradigm. What I wish more people understood is that you can be simultaneously scientific and open to mysteries. In fact, I would argue that being truly scientific requires being open to mysteries, because science is about investigating the unknown, not about defending what we already think we know. And there are so many incredible mysteries about consciousness, about connection, about the fundamental nature of reality that deserve serious, unbiased investigation. The question of animal telepathy is just a gateway to much larger, deeper questions about who we are, how we relate to each other and the world around us. Since I began this journey of experimentation and discovery with Theo, my life has changed in ways I didn't expect. I feel more connected, more present, more aware. I pay more attention to the subtle details in my interactions, not only with Theo, but with all the people and animals around me. I trust my intuition more because I've seen direct evidence that these intuitive perceptions are often grounded in reality. I feel less isolated, less separated, because I now have a visceral understanding that there is a web of connection connecting us that goes beyond the physical. And Theo? Well, he's always been a special dog, but now I see him with a different reverence. When I look into his eyes, I don't just see a cute pet. I see a conscious being with whom I share one of the deepest relationships of my life. A relationship that transcends language, transcends physical space, transcends the boundaries we thought existed between different species. He taught me that love builds bridges that science is still learning to measure, that connection is more fundamental to reality than we imagined, that there are ways of knowing the world that go beyond the 5 traditional senses. I'll end this video with an invitation to you. If you have a pet, if you have a strong bond with a non-human being, pay attention. Notice the strange moments of synchronicity, the moments when there seems to be a communication that can't be explained by conventional means. And if you want to go further, try experiments like the ones I did. Set up a camera, ask a friend for help, and test for yourself if you can mentally communicate with your animal. Do this with an open mind, but also with rigor. Don't accept weak evidence just because you want to believe, but also don't reject strong evidence just because it challenges your prior beliefs. Be a true citizen scientist. Investigate, experiment, and draw your own conclusions based on your own experiences. And then, if you find interesting results, share them. Share them in the comments here. Share them with friends. Write about them. Because the more people start paying attention to these phenomena, the more people start talking openly about their experiences without fear of ridicule, the closer we'll get to understanding what's really going on. And who knows, maybe our generation will finally be the one that expands the scientific paradigm to include these aspects of reality that have been ignored or dismissed until now. For now, I'll continue learning from Theo. I'll continue exploring this incredible connection we have. I'll continue to marvel at the mystery of it all. Because ultimately, regardless of how science eventually explains it, regardless of what we call this phenomenon, the experience is real, love is real, connection is real, and these are the most important, most precious things we have in this life. How lucky we are to share this planet with beings as special as our dogs, our cats, our animals, who remind us every day that there's more mystery and magic in the world than our materialistic philosophy ever dreamed of. And if you've made it this far in this long and dense video, I have much to thank you for. Leave a comment. Have you ever experienced a telepathic connection with your animal? Do you think there's something beyond the 5 known senses? Are you willing to try your own experiments? I'd love to hear your stories, your experiences, your opinions. And if you enjoyed this kind of deeper, more investigative content, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell because there's much more to come. Bye, everyone, and a special kiss to Theo, who's here by my side, reminding me it's time for his dinner, probably because I was just thinking about it 5 minutes ago. Understood, I'll continue the script until I reach the required 12,000 words. Continuation of the script. And since we're here, since you're still with me, let me delve deeper into some of the things I've discovered during this journey that I find absolutely fascinating. One of the questions I was asked most when I started sharing these experiences with close friends was, but wait, if this is real, why isn't it more widely known? Why isn't it in textbooks? Why isn't it taught in biology and veterinary schools? And that's an extremely valid question that deserves a deep and honest answer. The truth is, there's a complex and somewhat disturbing story about how science deals with phenomena that don't fit into the dominant materialist paradigm. Let's go back in time a bit. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the scientific community was much more open to investigating phenomena that today would be considered paranormal or pseudoscientific. Respected scientists like William James, one of the founders of modern psychology, seriously studied telepathy and other psychic phenomena. There were scientific societies dedicated to researching these subjects, such as the Society for Psychical Research in London, founded in 1882, which included several Nobel laureates and prestigious academics among its members. There was a genuine curiosity, a desire to explore the limits of human knowledge without excessive prejudice. But then something interesting happened throughout the 20th century. As physics and chemistry became increasingly successful in explaining natural phenomena through purely materialistic mechanisms, and as technology advanced dramatically based on this materialistic understanding, the scientific community became increasingly dogmatically materialistic. The idea that everything in the universe can be reduced to physical particles and forces, that consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon of the physical brain, that nothing exists beyond matter and energy as we understand it. This idea solidified not as a hypothesis to be tested, but as an axiomatic truth that could not be questioned. And any phenomenon that suggested there were aspects of reality that didn't fit this model began to be automatically rejected as impossible, regardless of empirical evidence. The problem is that this goes against the very spirit of science. Science should be about evidence, not philosophical dogma. But what has happened is that materialism has ceased to be a useful tool of investigation and has become an ideology, almost a religion. And like any religion, it has its priests, its heretics, its unquestionable doctrines. Scientists who dare to investigate phenomena considered anomalous or paranormal risk their careers. They have difficulty securing funding, publishing in respected journals, and being taken seriously by their peers. Not because their methodology is poor or their evidence weak, but simply because they are investigating things the establishment has decided cannot exist. Sheldrake experienced this firsthand. When he published his first book on morphic resonance in 1981, called A New Science of Life, he was viscerally attacked. Nature, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals, published a review saying the book should be burned. Burned! As if we were in the Middle Ages and he were a heretic. And what was his crime? Proposing a theory that challenged the established paradigm and presenting experimental evidence suggesting this theory might have merit. He wasn't making baseless claims. He was presenting testable hypotheses and empirical data. But the reaction was one of visceral rejection, not scientific curiosity. And look, I understand where this reaction comes from. Throughout history, there have been countless charlatans, countless people making extraordinary claims without any real evidence. There have been frauds, illusions presented as real psychic power, exploitation of vulnerable people. So it makes sense for scientists to be cautious, to demand extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. The problem is when this caution turns into an automatic refusal to investigate. When you say, "I'm not even going to look at the data because I already know it's impossible," you've stopped doing science and started practicing religious dogmatism. And the result of this is that many interesting and potentially important phenomena simply aren't adequately investigated. Animal telepathy is one example. There's thousands of anecdotal evidence. There are some rigorous studies showing statistically significant effects, but the vast majority of the scientific community simply ignores all of this. Not because they've done better studies showing that the phenomena don't exist, but because they've decided a priori that they can't. It's as if you have thousands of people reporting seeing a specific type of bird in a region. You have blurry but suggestive photos. You have some researchers claiming to have made controlled observations, but the official ornithological community simply refuses to send expeditions to verify it because they already know that that type of bird can't exist in that region. This leads me to wonder how many other phenomena might be being ignored by mainstream science simply because they don't fit into the established paradigm. How many other areas of research could reveal fascinating aspects of reality if they received the funding and serious attention they deserve? And more importantly, what are we missing as a society by not exploring these frontiers? Because ultimately, science isn't just about understanding the world out of intellectual curiosity. Science is about improving human life, developing useful technologies, and expanding our capabilities. And if forms of non-local communication between consciousnesses truly exist, imagine the practical applications of this if it were properly studied and understood. Consider, for example, therapeutic applications. There are already well-established therapy dog programs for people with PTSD, autism, depression, and anxiety. And these programs work. They work very well. But they're based on a fairly superficial understanding of why they work. The standard explanation is that animals provide companionship and unconditional affection, that interacting with them reduces cortisol and increases oxytocin. And yes, all of this is true. But what if there are deeper layers? What if the telepathic connection I experienced with Theo is part of the therapeutic mechanism? What if people with psychological disorders benefit not just from physical contact and companionship, but from a deep consciousness connection that helps regulate their emotional state in ways we don't yet fully understand? If this is true, then we should be studying how to optimize these connections. We should be developing training protocols not only for animals but for people as well, teaching them to open and strengthen these telepathic connections. We should be investigating whether certain types of meditative or focused attention practices can amplify therapeutic effects. But none of this is being done systematically because the scientific establishment denies that the basic premise, the existence of telepathic communication, is real. So we're leaving enormous therapeutic potential on the table because of paradigmatic bias. Or consider applications for people with communication disabilities, nonverbal autistic children, people with severe paralysis, people with aphasia after stroke. If telepathic communication is real and can be developed, it could open channels of communication for these people who are currently trapped within themselves. There are already some documented cases of people with severe autism who can communicate through animals in ways they can't with humans. What if we could better understand the mechanism of this and develop it intentionally? How much suffering could be alleviated? How many lives could be transformed? Or applications in emergency situations? Search and rescue teams often use dogs to find missing people. These dogs are incredible, with a sense of smell millions of times more sensitive than a human's. But what if there's an additional layer? What if well-trained rescue dogs with strong bonds with their handlers can not only follow scent trails, but also somehow tune into the missing person's consciousness? There are anecdotal reports of rescue dogs finding people in situations where scent trails were impossible due to weather or terrain conditions. How did they do it? Luck? Or were they using capabilities we don't officially recognize? These are fascinating and potentially very important questions, but they aren't being properly investigated. And this deeply frustrates me because I see potential being wasted. But at the same time, it gives me hope that more and more ordinary people, like me, are having these experiences, are questioning, and are investigating on their own. And with the internet, these experiences and investigations can be shared, forming a critical mass of empirical evidence that eventually cannot be ignored. Let me tell you about a few more of my specific experiences with Theo that reinforced my conviction that something real is going on here. After the initial experiments I described earlier, I decided to test other variables. One thing I wanted to test was the issue of distance. Does the strength of the connection decrease with distance? According to Sheldrake's morphic resonance theory, it shouldn't, because it's not a transmission of physical energy through space. It's a connection through a field that transcends space as we understand it. But I wanted to check it out for myself. So I did this. I arranged situations where I would be at varying distances from home. Sometimes I was at work, about 15 kilometers away. Sometimes I was at a friend's house on the other side of town, about 30 kilometers away. And on one particular occasion, I was traveling for work in a city 200 kilometers away. And in each of these situations, I made focused mental transmissions to Theo at random times determined by my friend who was coordinating the experiment, and compared them with video recordings of his behavior. And guess what? The distance made no statistical difference whatsoever. The correspondence rate was consistent regardless of whether I was 15 or 200 kilometers away. This is exactly what the theory predicts, but it was still shocking to see it confirmed in practice. Another variable I tested was the specificity of the message. In the first experiments, I was basically just sending a general feeling of, "I'm thinking of you, I love you, I want to be there." But what if I tried sending more specific messages? So I started doing experiments where I mentally visualized specific actions. For example, in one test, I spent 5 minutes vividly visualizing myself arriving home and taking Theo for a walk in the park. I imagined every detail: picking up the leash, putting it on him, walking out the door, walking to the park. When I came back and reviewed the recording, my jaw dropped. At the exact moment of the transmission, Theo had gone to the place where the leash is kept, picked it up in his mouth, and carried it to the front door. He never normally did that. He liked to go for walks, of course, but he wasn't in the habit of picking up the leash on his own. But at that specific moment, he did exactly that. Coincidence? Maybe. But it happened in other tests as well, with different visualizations. On another occasion, I visualized giving him a specific treat, a type of cookie he loves but that I didn't give him often. During the visualization, I imagined in detail the sound of the package opening, the smell of the cookie, the sensation of him eating it. And in the recording, at the time of the broadcast, Theo went straight to the cabinet where the treats are stored and began sniffing and scratching at the door. My mother, who was home and unaware of the experiment, even commented later that she found it strange that Theo had been so insistent at that particular moment without any obvious trigger. These specific message experiments were the most impressive to me because they eliminate a lot of the ambiguity. When the dog's behavior isn't just getting agitated or going to the window, but rather specific actions that directly correspond to the content of the mental visualization, it becomes much harder to explain as coincidence or confirmation bias. And look, I know this sounds absolutely crazy. I know it sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. But it happened. It's documented on video. I have the files, I have the timestamps, I have everything recorded, so I can review it as many times as I want and confirm that I'm not making it up or distorting the memories. And the more I practiced these focused mental transmissions, the more refined the connection seemed to become. It was like developing any other skill. At first, I had to work hard to stay focused, to visualize clearly, to truly feel the connection. But over time, it became more natural, easier. I began to be able to enter that state of focused transmission in a matter of seconds, no longer needing 5 minutes of preparation. And the success rate also increased. In the last experiments I did, I was getting match rates of over 80%, which is statistically extraordinary. But there's one aspect of all this that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's perhaps the most important. These experiences weren't just about proving that animal telepathy exists. They fundamentally changed how I see myself, how I see Theo, how I see the nature of consciousness and reality. Before all this, I had a very mechanical view of the world. I saw animals as creatures operating primarily on instinct and conditioning. I saw consciousness as something produced by the brain, confined to the skull, separate and isolated from other consciousnesses. I saw my relationship with Theo as beautiful and meaningful, of course, but fundamentally one-sided in the sense that I was the higher conscious creature caring for a lower one. But now I understand that consciousness is far more mysterious and far more interconnected than I imagined. Theo isn't less conscious than me. He just has a different kind of consciousness, perhaps even a kind of consciousness that in some ways is more developed than mine. He lives more in the present than I do. He feels things more directly, less mediated by verbal thought and rational analysis, and he has access to forms of perception and communication that I was completely unaware of until I started paying attention. Who is the superior creature here? The question doesn't even make sense. We're simply different, each with our own capabilities and limitations. And this made me completely rethink the ethical issues surrounding how we treat animals. If animals are conscious beings capable of telepathic connection, capable of deep love, capable of complex emotional suffering, then how do we justify the ways we treat them? I'm not just talking about obvious cruelty like abandonment or abuse. I'm talking about things we consider normal. Factory farming of animals in appalling conditions, unnecessary animal experimentation, even things like leaving dogs alone for many hours every day because we have to work. If this deep connection exists, if they experience our absence not just as a lack of physical companionship, but as a painful rupture of a telepathic bond, then we are causing far more suffering than we realize. I'm not saying I have simple answers to these ethical questions. They're complicated. We have to balance human needs with animal welfare. But what I am saying is that we need to approach these issues with much more seriousness and depth. We need to recognize that animals, especially those who have developed bonds with us, are not just objects or property. They are conscious beings with rich inner lives, capable of complex subjective experiences, capable of connections that transcend the physical. This changes everything about how we should treat them, about what responsibilities we have toward them. Since these revelations, I've changed several things in my life. I reduced my work hours so I could spend more time with Theo. It's not just about being physically present more, although that's important too. It's about honoring the bond we have, about recognizing that he's one of the most important and valuable relationships in my life. I started practicing focused meditation, where I dedicate time specifically to attuning to him, to consciously strengthen our telepathic connection. I've shifted to a more conscious diet regarding animal products, although this is an ongoing and imperfect process. And I've started talking more openly about these experiences, even though I know many people will think I'm crazy, because I feel it's important. I feel like if more people know these connections are possible, that they're real, maybe more people will start paying attention, treating their animals with more reverence and respect, and questioning scientific and philosophical paradigms that limit our understanding of reality. And if enough people do this, maybe we can culturally change how we relate to other life forms on this planet. One thing that has pleasantly surprised me since I started talking about this is how many people have similar stories of their own, but have never shared them for fear of ridicule. After I posted about this on social media, I received dozens of private messages from people sharing incredible experiences with their animals. Stories of cats waking their owners minutes before earthquakes. Stories of horses refusing to cross bridges that later collapsed. Stories of birds starting unusual vocalizations minutes before their owners received bad news. All these stories were out there. These experiences were happening, but people felt embarrassed to speak openly because they knew they would be ridiculed or dismissed as superstitious. But now we're beginning to create spaces where these experiences can be shared without shame, where they can be discussed seriously, where they can be investigated collectively. And that's powerful, because official science may not yet be ready to investigate this properly, but citizen science can do a lot. We can conduct our own experiments, share our data, compare our results, refine our methods. This is how many historical scientific advances began, with curious people observing phenomena, conducting simple experiments, sharing findings, gradually building a body of knowledge that eventually can no longer be ignored by the establishment. Look, I know I've been talking for a long time, and I truly appreciate you still being here with me on this journey. But there are still a few points I think are crucial to mention before I wrap up. One is the issue of selectivity. Not all dogs seem to have equally strong telepathic connections with their owners. Not all owners seem capable of establishing these connections. Why? Sheldrake suggests it has to do with the intensity of the emotional bond and the individual characteristics of both the animal and the human. Some dogs are naturally more attuned, more sensitive. Some humans are naturally more open to this kind of subtle perception. And a deep emotional bond seems to be a key catalyst. This makes sense when you think evolutionarily. Interspecies telepathy wouldn't be useful as a general ability. It would be useful specifically in the context of close relationships where enhanced communication brings mutual benefits. So it would make sense that the ability would be stronger in specific dyads, in human-animal pairs that have developed particularly intense bonds. And it would make sense that it would be an ability that can be cultivated and strengthened through attention and practice, as I experienced. Another important thing is to recognize limitations. Even in my most successful experiments, I never achieved 100% accuracy. Even when I was getting 80% accuracy, that means it didn't work 20% of the time. Why? I'm not sure. Sometimes I was more distracted, less focused. Sometimes Theo was deeply asleep or absorbed in some other activity. Sometimes it simply didn't seem to work for reasons I can't identify. And this is normal for any natural phenomenon, especially those dependent on subjective states of consciousness. Inconsistency doesn't invalidate the reality of the phenomenon. It just shows that it is complex and dependent on multiple variables. It's also important not to over-romanticize. Having a telepathic connection with your dog doesn't mean you're always in perfect sync. It doesn't mean all behavioral issues disappear. It doesn't mean the relationship is always harmonious and conflict-free. Theo still does things that irritate me. He still barks excessively sometimes, he still destroys slippers occasionally, he still pulls on the leash when we're out walking. The telepathic connection coexists with all the normal, mundane, and sometimes frustrating aspects of having a dog. It's not magic that transforms everything into perfection. It's just an added layer of depth in an already complex and multifaceted relationship. And it's important to maintain a healthy skepticism even when you have experiences that seem to confirm the existence of these phenomena. Always question your own interpretations. Always consider alternative explanations. Always be open to the possibility of being wrong. This is the true scientific spirit. The difference between healthy skepticism and dogmatism is that healthy skepticism is open to changing one's mind based on evidence, while dogmatism has already decided on the answer and rejects contradictory evidence. So yes, I believe, based on my experiences and the research I've done, that animal telepathy is real. But I remain open to being wrong. I remain open to discovering that perhaps it's something different than I think. Perhaps it can be explained through mechanisms we don't yet understand, but that don't involve a non-local connection of consciousness. I remain curious and eager to continue investigating, experimenting, and learning. And this is the stance I invite you to adopt as well. Don't blindly believe what I'm saying just because it seems interesting or comforting. Investigate it yourself. Conduct your own experiments. Question everything, including your own conclusions. But do so with a genuinely open mind, not one that has already decided it knows all the answers. Because the universe is far stranger, far more wonderful, far more mysterious than any current scientific or philosophical paradigm can fully encompass. And the greatest discoveries, the greatest adventures of knowledge, are yet to come for those brave enough to explore the frontiers, to question dogma, to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Theo is here beside me now as I record this, and I look at him and feel immense gratitude. Gratitude not only for his company, for his unconditional love, but for the door he opened for me. A door to a deeper understanding of reality. A door to connections I didn't know existed. A door to mysteries that make life infinitely richer and more fascinating. He is my teacher as much as he is my companion. And I suspect that all the animals with whom we share our lives have similar lessons to teach us. If we are willing to pay attention, if we are willing to go beyond the materialistic assumptions we have been taught, if we are willing to open our minds and hearts to possibilities that official science is not yet ready to acknowledge. So this is my final invitation to you. Pay attention, observe, experiment, question, share. And above all, honor the deep connections you have with the non-human beings in your life. They are portals to extraordinary mysteries. They are reminders that we are part of a web of consciousness that encompasses much more than our own species. They are teachers who can show us ways of perceiving and relating to the world that our modern culture has almost completely forgotten. Leave your experiences, your questions, your stories in the comments. Let's create a community of curious explorers, of people willing to challenge paradigms, of people who deeply love their animals and want to truly understand the nature of these extraordinary bonds we share with them. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, because this journey is just beginning and there is so much more to discover, to explore, to share. Thank you for being here with me. Thank you for being open-minded. Thank you for caring. And a special thanks to Theo, my four-legged teacher, my portal to the mystery, my telepathic best friend. See you next time, everyone.